Hello. Tonight, let us drift through the misty hills and forgotten paths of the distant past, to a time when the world moved slowly, guided by the sun and the turning of the seasons. A time when peasants tilled the soil with weathered hands, and the village was the whole of one's world. Our story begins at the edge of a great and ancient forest, in a small hamlet called Hearthvale. Tucked between moss-covered stones and low, grassy hills, Hearthvale was a place of smoke curling from thatched roofs, of wooden fences leaning with age, of chickens scratching in the mud, and children chasing each other barefoot. There were no kings here, no silver, no armor, only men and women with dirt under their nails and quiet hope in their hearts. The peasants of Hearthvale were born to hardship, but their lives were not without peace. They rose at dawn, when the rooster's call echoed across the fields, and gathered around the central hearth, a great stone circle where embers smoldered all through the night. Porridge bubbled in an iron pot, and the scent of rye and nettles drifted lazily in the cool morning air. They were bound to the land serfs, as the lords would call them, but they belonged to the earth far more than they belonged to any nobleman. They knew its moods and its seasons, its droughts and its secrets. Old Mattie, the village herbalist, would speak of the roots that healed and the ones that harmed. She said that the forest whispered to those who listened, and many believed her. She had lived through 3 winters without losing a goat, after all. By midsummer, the fields of barley waved like golden seas. The villagers gathered together to reap and bind, singing songs older than memory, their rhythms slow and steady. Children watched from the shade of elm trees, learning the stories behind every tool, every motion. And though their lives were shaped by toil, there was laughter around the fire at night. There were songs sung softly, while patching clothes by candlelight, and tales told of fey creatures in the woods, of brave knights who never came to Hearthvale, and of saints who watched over them in silence. Still, not all was gentle in the life of a medieval peasant. Taxes were collected in grain and chickens, and the steward of the lord would ride in with boots far cleaner than any in the village. He would nod to the headman and count the sacks, never smiling. But the villagers endured, because they had to, because no knight nor king would plow their fields or mend their roofs, because if they didn't survive, no one else would survive for them. They shared what little they had. When bread was short, it was sliced thinner, not hoarded. When a roof leaked, all hands helped patch it. And when a child was born, the whole village celebrated, for each new soul was a spark against the long dark of winter. There was faith, too. Each Sunday, the villagers walked barefoot to the tiny stone chapel, where Father Branwen, more farmer than priest, spoke of mercy and saints. He had a crooked back and a kind voice, and no one left his sermons without a lighter heart. They prayed for good harvests, for rain when needed, for protection from wolves, from fever, and from the cruel winds that sometimes swept down from the mountains. And when their prayers weren't answered, they worked harder still. As the year turned, they marked the feasts and fasts with solemn joy. The feast of Candlemas, the rites of Lammas, the turning of the maypole with flowers braided in the hair of young girls. These were the days that reminded them they were more than laborers. They were a people woven together like a tapestry. And so, through seasons of plenty and lean, through moments of warmth and worry, the villagers of Hearthvale lived and survived. But their resilience would soon be tested, in ways none of them could have imagined. The rains would come too long, too heavy. The fields would wither, and then something darker would slip through the land, carried on wind and rumor. The year the rain would not stop began with promise. The spring air was soft and fragrant, and the peasants of Hearthvale sowed their seeds as they had done every year. Barley, rye, broad beans, and oats, tucked carefully beneath the moist, breathing earth. But then the skies darkened, and the rain began to fall. Not the gentle kind that brings life and laughter, but a gray, endless drizzle. That turned the paths to sludge and the fields to drowning pools. By midsummer, the grain had rotted in the soil. Sprouts blackened before they could rise, and the earth, once sweet and crumbly, stank of mold and decay. Children sat quietly beneath the eaves, watching water drip through thatch. Their parents, once so full of rhythm and routine, now moved with silent urgency. Each meal became thinner. Each day, a little longer than it should have been. The old ways were tested. Women gathered nettles, not for healing teas, but for soup. Dried thistles were boiled until they softened. Moss scraped from tree bark was ground and baked with barley husks, becoming something almost like bread. They called it famine cake, a bitter, chewy thing. It filled the belly, but weighed the spirit. In the common hall, where warmth usually lived, talk was sparse and cautious. The villagers were not strangers to hardship, but this was different. The rain would not stop. Even the goats began to sicken. And yet, they endured. They always had. They remembered old tales of the great famine of the elder generations, when whole villages vanished and fields were left to weeds. But Hearthvale had something others did not. They had each other. Old Mattie, the herbalist, shared her root cellars. Brother Eldrick, a wandering monk, appeared at the edge of the woods one morning, clothed in rags but carrying knowledge in his satchel. He spoke of remedies from the south, how dried seaweed could ward off gut sickness, and how bee balm could keep fevers from spreading. They gave him shelter, and in return, he taught them how to dry meat using smoke and river stones, how to keep potatoes in cool earth, and how to trap small birds without wasting strength. Every small success became a story retold by the fire, like how young Elsie found eggs in a forgotten hayloft, or how Tom the carpenter carved a water diverter to keep the grain stores dry. Moments of ingenuity became moments of hope. They learned to share more, to speak less of what they lacked and more of what they still had. And in the chapel, beneath the dripping rafters, Father Branwyn no longer prayed for bounty. He prayed for enough warmth to survive the night, enough bread to calm the smallest stomach, enough faith to believe spring would return. By the second winter, thinness was everywhere. Men buckled their belts tighter. Children's faces looked older than their years, but no one in Hearthvale was left to starve alone. When one family's stores ran out, others brought roots and strips of dried turnip. It was not a feast, but it was life. And then, just as quietly as it had come, the rain began to ease. In the third year, the earth drank slowly instead of drowning. The sun emerged shyly, and the fields, though scarred, began to breathe again. A soft cheer went up one April morning when the first barley sprout pushed through the soil. It was hardly taller than a finger, but to the villagers of Hearthvale, it was a miracle. They had survived, not by strength alone, nor by the grace of kings, but by memory and kindness, by old secrets and shared struggle, and by that deep, quiet courage known only to those who live with the earth. They did not know what else the world would bring, but they knew now that they could endure it, and so they did, for a time. But there are dangers greater than hunger. Not all storms come from the sky. There are some that drift in silence on the breath of strangers. And one day, death would come to Hearthvale not in want, but in shadow. The summer that followed the famine was different. The sky, once gray for so long, now burned with heat. Crops grew again timidly at first, then more boldly as if encouraged by the sun itself. The people of Hearthvale dared to smile again. The children's laughter returned to the fields, and bread once more browned in the hearths of low cottages. But beneath the joy, there was a stillness, like the hush before a storm. It began not in Hearthvale, but far away, in towns built of stone, where merchants traveled and ships unloaded wares from distant lands. Word came first. not from a herald or scroll, but from a peddler. A man with cracked boots and eyes too wide. He spoke of death in the cities, of black boils and breathless nights, of whole streets gone quiet. He was offered bread and water, but did not stay. He disappeared into the forest, muttering prayers too fast to understand. The villagers of Hearthvale listened to his words in silence. They had known hunger. They had known cold. But what he described was neither. Still, they returned to their work. There was grain to mill, sheep to mend. Time, after all, never stopped for fear. But within weeks, fear came walking. The first to fall ill was Gera, the old widow who kept to herself. A cough, a fever, and then the swelling angry lumps beneath her arms and at her throat. Father Branwen came to sit with her, and he said she passed quietly. By the next sunrise, 2 more had taken to bed. By the end of the week, 6. The village had no physician. Only Maddie, who had herbs and instincts, and Brother Aldrich, who remembered some Latin names for sickness. But even they looked pale now. Maddie tried sage and honey, boiled lavender, and burned ash bark in the sick rooms. Nothing worked. So the villagers did what their ancestors had done. They turned to the old ways. They rang bells through the night to chase away the evil air. They hung herbs over doorways, wormwood, rue, and yarrow. They painted crosses in ash upon their doors, and some, in desperation, covered their mouths with cloth soaked in vinegar. Hearthvale, being distant from the main roads, escaped the worst of the death that swallowed the cities. But the fear never left. They buried their dead in the soft hill behind the chapel, marking the mounds with wooden wheels or small stones. And for every soul lost, they sang not in sorrow, but as a promise that the names would not be forgotten. Those who fell ill were kept in the old grain barn. It had become a place of quiet prayers and whispered last words. Some recovered frail but alive. Others did not. The children were kept close. The chapel bell was rung at dawn and dusk. And every morning the air was thick with incense and the distant chant of psalms. And yet, not all of the plague's touch was death. Some things, in the stillness, began to change. With fewer mouths, there was more food. With fewer to serve, the steward from the Lord's manor came less often. The peasants began to tend not only their tiny strips, but the overgrown fields left empty by the gone. No one asked, they simply did. And in the quiet, they found room to breathe, to speak of things they hadn't dared, to gather and discuss, not just the planting of turnips or the patching of roofs, but how they might live better. When the worst of the sickness had passed, and the last of the plague mounds had grown green with new grass, the village did not return to what it had been. It could not. The rhythm of life beat slower. The days were softer. And though they still bowed their heads in prayer, it was now with a deeper understanding of how fragile every breath truly was. They were survivors of more than famine now. They had stared death in the face and learned to live alongside it. There was still hardship ahead. That much was certain. But Hearthvale had changed, not with banners or rebellion, but with quiet strength. And something was beginning to stir in the hearts of those once called lowly, for they had learned something powerful, that even in the shadow of death, a peasant could endure. And not just endure, but hope. The morning after the final frost of that long gray spring was quiet in Hearthvale, not mournful, not cold, just still. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm has passed, but before the rebuilding begins. The people emerged from their cottages, thin but standing, wrapped in wool patched more times than anyone could count. Their faces bore the lines of sorrow. Yes, but their hands were busy again. The village had survived famine. It had survived plague. And now it faced something more familiar, but no less heavy. The return of the Lord's steward. He came on horseback, with a blue sash over his shoulder and parchment in hand. Behind him rode 2 men in armor, not shining, but real enough. He read aloud from the scroll, his voice thin against the wind. The noble Lord Everard, rightful holder of these lands, does extend his greetings to the people of Hearthvale, and requests from them the full delivery of dues unpaid these past 2 years. In wheat, in hens, in coin, and in labor. No one spoke. The steward looked at the crowd, noticing the empty spaces between the villagers. Noticing, perhaps, how many fewer faces there were. His voice faltered. This was not the same village he had known. Before the famine, before the sickness, the people of Hearthvale had lowered their eyes when spoken to. Now they looked at him evenly, calmly, not defiantly, just without fear. Old Maddie stood forward first. Her voice was soft, but sure. "We gave our dead to the hill," she said. "We gave our grain to the hungry, and our strength to the fields. What we have now, we built with our own hands. Not by the Lord's coin, not by his grace, but by surviving." Father Brandwin added his words, as did Tom the carpenter and Elric, who had lost all his kin, but still rose with the sun to plow what remained. They did not threaten. They did not shout. They simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, with quiet dignity. The steward paused. He looked down at his scroll, then back at the villagers. And though he did not bow, he did not press them that day. Time passed. More harvests came. New children were born and given the names of those lost. The lords, weakened by years of unrest and death, began to lean more heavily on the labor of the few who remained. But Hearthvale, like many small villages across the land, had begun to think differently. They formed a council, not of nobility, but of the oldest and the wisest. They met in the chapel each week, discussing seed stores, roof repairs, and what share of bread each family would need in the lean months. They bartered with travelers. They learned new methods from passing monks. They rebuilt not only their homes, but their sense of worth. One evening, many seasons after the sickness, Brother Aldrich stood before a crowd of villagers. He had parchment in his hand, but it was not a tax scroll. It was a charter, a simple agreement written by candlelight, stating that the people of Hearthvale would share the land, would make decisions together, and would not wait on the mercy of lords. It was not rebellion. It was something quieter, but perhaps more powerful. It was freedom. So when winter returned, as it always did, the people of Hearthvale were ready. Their grain stores were full. Their goats were fat, and their hearts were light. They sang again around the fire, not just to forget the past, but to honor it. They had learned that survival was not just about food and shelter, but about kindness, memory, and the will to carry one another through the dark. They were peasants, yes, but more than that, they were the root and branch of the land itself. And no lord, no plague, no famine could take that from them. Sleep well now. The fires are lit, the harvest is stored, and the people are at peace. Let your dreams carry you to the quiet fields beyond the forest, where even the smallest lives change the course of the world by surviving together.